Hello, everyone. I'm so excited for madness and the occult intersections. Really, how culture, madness, and magic really collide. I really think that there is a big intersection here that, as practitioners, as students of occult and various different spiritual practices, that if we don't address these things, we're missing out on a big chunk of some really interesting things that we're seeing in society. So my intention for tonight's class is to bring a little bit of the understanding of history of madness and occult intersections, to explore some hidden history, particularly around madness, psychiatry, a lot of liminal kind of space, and how linguistics and context and culture really help to define what madness is. Coming away with defining madness for yourself, which sounds very like, oh my goodness, what power we wield here. But I really want you all to feel comfortable with defining madness for yourself, especially as occultists, and we'll be talking about that. And to come away with a nuanced perspective on psychiatry, madness, occult practice, and spirituality, because these are such charged topics in many ways that we want to do it in a way that feels empowering. And even right before the class started, we were talking very much about this, of how these charged and different practices can be supportive to us or detrimental to us. So how do we discern these various practices for ourselves? And for those of you that are keeping count of your kind of credits for the different topics for SOA, this is going to be a little bit about witch tools, a lot of history, and some folk magic as well. I want to share, and this is something that I shared also during the Kabbalah lecture, but the little Jewish Aggadah or legend that I think is very apt for the class this evening, whether it's around madness or occult studies. And this is particularly about spiritual practices and entering the hidden wisdom or the occult knowledge around the Torah. And I think these are 4 different gateways or consequences that we may have when we engage in this work. And the parable or the legend goes that 4 entered the Pardes, or the garden of esoteric knowledge. This would be the Torah. 1 looked and died. 1 looked and went mad. 1 looked and apostatized, and 1 entered in peace and departed in peace. So knowing these kind of levels of consciousness or ways of receiving occult information or engaging in our practices, this may be helpful. And apostatized just means you've gotten this knowledge and now you're just like an apostle and you're sharing the word or the breakthrough that you had, right? Or you're taking on a teacher role through various different esoteric knowledge. So just something to think about here as we engage in conversation this evening. So in the chat, I am so curious, how do you all define madness? So I'll be sharing some definitions from various different, from Merriam-Webster all the way to the clinical way, to the cultural way, to my personal definition around it. But I'm curious, what does madness look like and is defined by you? And you can drop those in the chat. We'll have like a minute or 2 and then we can read them out loud, because this is going to veer the conversation in a certain way. And there's no right or wrong answers. And if you're uncertain, that's totally valid too. Like, I don't know, this is a broad word, right? So we're getting a couple in here. a differing perception of reality from others, one which makes it difficult to partake in shared reality with those who differ in belief. Ooh, I love that. I'm seeing some nods. Yes, yes. Definitely resonating. Non-productive diffusion of the will. Ooh, interesting on that one, right? The not esoteric, but the exoteric diffusion, the outside representation of will. And this, I see this in mind, body, and spirit. And correct me if I'm wrong on that in the chat, but that's how I took that. It's just kind of splattered everywhere. And we'll have about another minute or so. I think these are some great thoughts on defining madness that I think will make sense for some of the actual current definitions. All righty. So if any other ones come in, I will keep an eye on the chat. So here we have some artistic and cultural representations of madness. We have a few more as well, but the Edvard Munch grabbing of the face, the scream, right? Iconic. Everyone around the world knows it. It's this grief, it's the sadness, it's the I am done. What is that? The exasperation of a feeling. I like to call this almost being in the muchness, right? The fullness of if we're going to go tarot, cups and water. We are drowning in the feelings right now, right? That's a very much Edvard Munch. Then we have Yayoi Kusama up in the right corner in one of her obliteration pieces, right? Seeing the obliteration of the self, which many of us know, and in occult circles, that is a big subject that's being talked about, is the obliteration of the self. Seeing almost like a cosmic mirroring of the inside parts. How do we make the ethereal externalized? And I think Yayoi Kusama does a very good job as a self-identified mad person of doing that representation as well. And then we have something that's a little bit more, this could be even more diffusion of a particular will or very focused madness in a way with the blue period of Picasso, when he went through a period of grief, of breaking down the foundation of who he is, what he believed as an artist, grief of a friend, living what we romanticize as the starving artist's life. And actually, this is what came from it, right? So this is another way of looking at madness as well, as a representation of what am I reacting to within society, the kind of more spiritual obliteration, also the muchness of emotion, the overwhelm. There's three kind of general examples of muchness from an artistic perspective. And then we have what's known kind of a little bit more modern day or going into the future, the psychoanalyst's room. This one's Freud's psychoanalyst room. We're going to start with the OG, Freud, and having the couch where you lay down or the chair where you lay down, and there's talk therapy. And then we have the psychiatric movements where we have little bit more of an exploration or trying to find the science of what is the medical issue here that's physical, that we can actually find medication for. That is this a spiritual thing? Is this a mad thing? Is this a biological issue? Do we know? This is where we'll get into the history, but we see psychiatric medication being represented here. And then we've talked about it a little bit before class, but delusions and hallucinations, things that are causing us a lot of distress, things that may or may not be there that we're experiencing, that either cause us to harm ourselves or others. which is where I go into a little bit of my definition of madness. And there's a couple of different ways here, right? With madness, there are layers and layers, but an active state of being where the mind is interfering with the sovereign choice of the individual. A disorder, which is a word that gets thrown around. And if we think about the origin, this is where linguistics is our friend when it comes to madness, right? Of order and the order of things that be, and this is the not. A disorder causing distress to self and others that hinders the individual to live their potential, or to be content even, right? Which, let's talk about society on that one. We'll put a pin in that. And then cultural and contextual divergence, behavior, and an inability to, distinguish between, let's go back here because I have all the chats open, between fantasy and reality, which, right, even that in itself can have a whole spectrum of what that is. Like, are we going to a role-playing LARP situation at a Renaissance fair, or are we like completely buying into a story of our creation? And this is where the occult and mad intersections kind of interweave. And this is where that slippery slope can take us. And I think something that we talked about right before class, of this discernment between what is for our highest good and the highest good of all, right? Because we are not just sovereign individuals, but also within community and within society, that we can use our occult practices to bring that versus to our detriment, where we notice, oh, I'm going down a certain path of harm, right? And we talk about in various occult practices the do no harm, which is also the medical model promise that we make to patients, to clients, as practitioners, as facilitators, that is a promise that we make for ourselves, that we do no harm. And I still like to keep that in various and all practices that I engage in. So a little brief, very brief history of psychiatry that I think will give us a broader picture that it's actually quite shocking of how modern and switched up things are today, from biology to theory, not to discredit the psychiatric profession, but to give us some context with various things. And I'm gonna close the chat here so I can make sure that I see it all. And can everyone see the screen okay? I know it's a little bit tinier font. Okay, great. So the first kind of beginnings of psychiatry and psychology was the merging of biology and the idea of all these things that priests were doing, shamans were doing, philosophers were philosophizing about, and putting this into an actual science. How do we measure insanity? Because at the time too, anyone that was neurodivergent or different from the norm, which we know is influenced a lot by culture, a lot by religion, a lot by many different factors. If you were different, you went straight to an asylum, right? There was no space for anything different, and people did not know what to do with these folks. There was the idea of the four humors, which was the medical model of the times, like, oh, I have too much bile, too much air, too much this, right? And then we discredited that. Then there was magnetism with different magnetic fluids, where we got hypnotism from, but the magnetism idea didn't really survive and wasn't really viable. And so from there we said, well, this looks like a nervous system situation. This is something with the nerves. So we were starting to get a little bit more on the right track here. And so in the early 1800s, for the first century of its existence, the field concerned itself with severely disordered individuals, keeping in mind, again, the linguistics of things. Culturally, you are divergent, you are maybe disruptive, right? Whatever that may be at the time. And then they were confined to asylums or hospitals. These patients were generally deemed as psychotic, severely depressed, or manic, or suffered conditions we would recognize as medical. So this would even go into dementia, brain tumors, seizures, hypothyroidism. So some more of those other medical issues that would also show up in our behaviors, our moods, and our emotions. So they were all kind of lumped together because we did not know anything about the brain. And one of the things that I always tell people is the kind of final frontiers that we have are the brain, the bottom of the ocean, and then outer space. We still do not know. We are still discovering every day various different things. We then switch over to not just biologists, doctors, and the beginning of like the nervous system doctors, which then became the neurologists that would analyze brains, look at different issues within the brain. But neurologists started to treat nervous conditions, so named for their presumed origin in disordered nerves. So seeing that there were various different things upon autopsy, that these brains were different, or these brains were diseased, right? And seeing some of the physical manifestations of something that before they didn't see in regular healthy brains. So we started seeing a little bit of that. We then move into the 20th century, and Sigmund Freud, at the time, a psychiatrist, neurologist, kind of in the middle, publishes a paper on unconscious psychoneurosis and developed psychoanalysis. He started noticing people that were in the asylums that didn't have like dementia or were dealing with different, more extreme neurodivergencies, that they just were dealing with grief or didn't know how to deal with the world after leaving their family, and developed psychoanalysis as a form of talk therapy. So yes, Freud, everyone knows him, but actually he was just kind of building on what was already there. And he saw a few case studies with people that found from just talking and treating them like a human, imagine that, right? That you were given space, that all of a sudden after a few sessions, which his sessions were really long, maybe sometimes even 6 hours, where you're sitting and psychoanalyzing with Freud in the room. Also, this was a certain type of person, right, that could afford that type of treatment. So keeping that in mind, that that was a certain class of people with a certain class of problems, that after a few sessions, they had the tools that they needed. They just needed somebody to talk to, right? And this is where we started seeing a split, because the biology-oriented psychiatrists, the neurologists, were looking at, well, we don't know about this about the brain, and you're just talking to people. How can we measure that within the brain? You can't measure a conversation, right? That we see that change in their behavior, but we don't see, you know, like how does this actually happen when they were in severe distress because they were grieving, which is a normal emotion. But for them, you know, at the time, it was not. It was very disordered. So to this day, from that, there has been a split. And we see that there's one direction where it goes towards psychiatry, biology, and now we're seeing today a switch a little bit maybe to the other extreme of there is no mental illness, there is no disorder, right? And it's like, well, how do we find this middle, right? And I believe really much in the middle path if we're going to get Buddhist about it. But honestly, we'll hear how this goes. So 1950s, 60s. So this is still fairly recent, everybody. Thorazine, another first generation antipsychotics, profoundly improved institutionalized psychotic patients. Newly developed antidepressants for the severely depressed were also developed. State mental hospitals rapidly emptied as medicated patients returned to the community. And this is where we start seeing the deinstitutionalization movement because of the just horrible ways that people were treated in them. Anybody that didn't fit into society or even had different political values in various parts of the world were institutionalized and re-educated. There's lots and lots of issues. Again, brief history of psychiatry. We start seeing the anti-psychiatry movement start coming forward as well. Like the way that the doctors are not really seeing the patients, the nurses and the hierarchies that are here, are they really creating a healing environment? And they were saying not. However, these new medications that came on the scene were found to be really helpful for folks dealing with more intense, disturbing, disordered thinking, experiencing, not being able to function in society, right? Which can be a good or bad thing, depending on the society that be. So then we get into, again, pretty recent 1980s, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, our good friend, the DSM of mental disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association, becomes radically revised. So unlike the prior two editions, which included psychoanalytic language, this goes into the psychoneuroses. This goes into some of the thought patterns, some of the discussions that would happen in talk therapy, which wasn't deemed scientific enough, even though there were case studies of people that it helped. It became symptom-based. So I love that right at the beginning of class, we were talking about like, well, I was looking through the DSM and it said like this and this and this. And I'm like, yes. And we all have a little bit of that. And what we're looking at with the DSM, and we never want to self-diagnose, this is all for educational purposes only, is like we look at clusters and patterns of certain behaviors that become disordered, or they're not allowing us to live to our full potential, or they're causing us harm, right? But we see that in the DSM-3 was symptom-based and kind of atheoretical. It's just like, well, here are the symptoms that we see. Let's like clump them together. And it described mental disorders without reference to a theory of cause. This was intended to kind of prevent common language so that the biological and psychoanalytic psychiatrists could talk to each other. So they were trying to build the bridge between the neurologists, biologists, neurobiologists, psychiatrists, and the psychoanalysts together. Be like, here's the symptoms. Here's what you got to put in for insurance. Here's what you got to put in for actually giving the diagnosis and then for medication. And to improve the statistic reliability of psychiatric diagnosis. So collecting how many of these symptoms were present was also kind of this active making of the DSM too. Like if I have these clusters of things with these particular clients, then, oh, here's an anxiety disorder, or here's bipolar type 1, or here's obsessive compulsive disorder, right? And all of these started developing over time. 1987, we start seeing the commercialization of SSRIs. And I don't even remember, or for some of you that may remember the old commercial of the little Prozac guy, that was a sad little circle with a rain cloud over him. I'm like, wow, they're getting real creative with these psychiatric drug marketing. And so there was also a shift towards funding of neuroscience and psychiatric drug research, because we saw that the institutions were kind of leaving, but also at the time there was the big anti-psychiatric movement happening. So there were multiple things happening where we're like, let's not do this whole asylum thing, which there still are institutions, but we'll get into that in a little bit. We start seeing that shift in funding go straight into like, let's get medication, let's get the biology ready, because we have these clumps of symptoms. Let's get these SSRIs, let's get these other kinds of generic drugs available to as many people as possible. Good intentions, right? Because we want to help people, but also like, here's a clump of human emotions that may be disordered that we'll try it out, right? We're trying to medicalize it. We're using the medical model for something that is just some very ethereal. And sometimes, of course, it can be very disordered, but this is the science that we're using, the very rational way of looking at things. And then in 1994, biological psychiatry triumphs, as does clinical psychology, with the development of cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is where we have a huge win on the psychoanalytic side, on the talk therapy side with cognitive behavioral therapy. We knew that there were case studies from Freud, but now we actually have some case studies from using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is noticing different cognitive distortions, ways of thinking, and then using the method of what is the thought, what is the feeling around the thought, what is the action, how do we transform the way of thinking, right? And calling it out, not in a negative way, but just noticing it objectively as the clinician does. And they were able to find case studies that changed behavior radically, just like how Freud was doing with more psychoanalytic dream work and and other depth kind of psychology concepts. So we start seeing this win on the other side. So we're like, oh, okay, not everyone needs medication for these clumps of emotions that may be distressing for folks. Like, oh, well, actually, we can journal through things, or we can discuss things or analyze things, which is really exciting. And then in the early 2000s, we find that there's no new classes of medication or kind of big psychiatric drugs being discovered. We kind of did the big work at the beginning that we could, as much as we can, with SSRIs and antidepressants and things like that. But then we start seeing the longer term side effects of some of those medications. And they start to hit the headlines. So from the big marketing and funding, we start seeing the push and, well, here's the good stuff with this, but also here's the bad, right? We're always having the both and with these situations, because it's still a relatively new development. Then as early as 2013, we have the reevaluation of medical and biological bias in the new edition of the DSM. So we're like, okay, we've swung in this direction. Now we're swinging in another direction. How do we look at the biases here, right? Because these are all humans dealing with human emotions and human experiences, and what is normal and what is not, right? And these get into the bigger philosophical questions. This gets into the culture that be, right? The language that we use. And then today, we're leaning more towards a holistic and all-encompassing view of the whole person. So we are looking and having people work with a care team of a psychiatrist, of a talk therapist. If there needs to be institutionalization of that individual for harm or for protection, there is also that available. But we're also looking at societal things. We're also looking at the religious and the spiritual aspect of that person, right? Because from one person to the next, what may be normal is not, right? So we're bringing a more of a full, all-encompassing view within psychiatry and psychology, which is really exciting. And a little bit less, we go from super intense to like super science, to then super like, let's turn away from the science, right? To how do we have all of these things work together, which I feel is a more holistic view, which I hope helps with the madness piece and how evolving the word madness is, and how it's even evolved in representation in society so far, which is really exciting, as it looks like it's on a positive upswing with some more nuance, because we love some nuance at SOA. I did want to talk too about some of the triads of the beginning of psychoanalysis that also intersects with occult thinking. And we have, of course, Sigmund Freud, who then mentored Carl Jung, who then mentored Sabina Spellrein, who unfortunately many people don't know. And like, oh, we got the earliest woman physician and psychiatrist that worked with some amazing people, who also was kind of taking occult practice or occult concept to an even further level than Jung did. Because I would say Jung or Freud brought in, let's go into the unconscious, let's go into some of the things that we are not seeing. Then Jung said, let's go into the collective unconscious, and also self-obliteration, where he himself in the Red Book documents his own self-obliteration and analyzes that and how important that was for his own becoming. But then Sabina Spellrein takes it to the next level of you coming into being through destruction, through a way that isn't, it's the both and, right? It's self-destruction in a way that is also sustainable, so that you can live out your purpose, you reach your sovereign self, you are healthy, you are wise. It's going into the crazy wise a little bit here. And so she was the one that kind of took it to that next level here, which is really exciting. Unfortunately, she did not survive the Holocaust. And so many of her works didn't get through, and why we don't really hear much about her. We hear about Freud and we hear about Carl Jung, but she, like one of the earliest women that was doing incredible research, worked hand in hand with Freud and Jung at the same time, a Russian immigrant woman coming into Switzerland and doing research. It was amazing what she was doing for the time. So I just want to give a little shout out to her here. And for anyone interested in some more of that coming into being through destruction, through an occult practice, but also through her medical practice, I highly recommend looking at her work. And one of my favorite clinicians, one of my favorite psychiatrists, that he wanted to be part of the deinstitutionalization, but refused to be part of the anti-psychiatry movement because he was getting super meta and philosophical about things. And he said there is a need for it, but also sovereignty is super, super important. And how does this affect society? How does this affect legality, right? If you are no longer, you're no longer suffering the consequences of your actions through an insane, right, verdict, then where does that leave us? So he's bringing some more of the societal and the legal ramifications of insanity and madness. So he's really questioning these things. And this is where linguistics and occult thought come together, and how important it is that the words we use create the reality in front of us. So he's one that is touching on that. And a lot of people will misinterpret his work because he's very meta about things. But I think many of you will appreciate his work. One of his books is called Mental Illness is a Myth. And he's taking it from, again, the legal, the political, the socio-political and economic perspectives of that. He's not denying that there is mental illness, but it's in the way that we're talking about this evening. It's something that is a bit more expansive, and he brings up the philosophical, the religious, the spiritual. Who are you to name that? What is the governing body of that, right? And having us really reflect on that question, because then we're like, well, oh my God, who is it, right? Who is the master of that way? And in occult practice, right, we are doing that inner work to receive that knowledge, to unlock that esoteric knowledge. So he believed that in, and I will move this here because it always cuts it out here, but I want to see your smiling faces. Believing that psychiatric hospitals are like prisons, not hospitals, and that psychiatrists who subject others to coercion function as judges and jailers and not physicians. This goes back to the do no harm promise, right? And Saz made efforts to abolish involuntary psychiatric hospitalization for over 2 decades. This was his mission. One of those think for yourself, question everything, which is what we do as occultists. It's like, but is this the reality though? Is this something that I want to step into, or am I in agreement with? And I love that by adolescence, he found that inquiring to the justification for locking up mad people is taboo. Crazy people belong in madhouses. Only a crazy person would ask why, right? This goes back to the context and the culture. He thought even then that mental illness was not an illness, right? And then consenting your consciousness is a big part of his healing philosophy. So the people that want to go into the healing work are going to go into the healing work. Let's go up here. So now, same thing here in the chat, defining occult. I know I've dropped that word many times, and we are in the school of occult arts. But what does occult mean for you? How does that show up for you? I'll have about a minute or so, and I'll keep the chat open here. That knowledge which is hidden, the sciences of the unknown. Yes. Hidden knowledge, the unknown, the beyond, the unseen. Occult to me is unknown knowledge. Ooh, interesting. Yeah, because it's hidden. We don't know it yet. It's unknown to me. It's the what I don't know, I don't know. Unspeakable knowledge, I like too. Oh, yes, right? which is something we've talked about at SOA, the beyond word knowledge. Yes. And like, how do we put that into words? Something a little bit beyond words. Fabulous. A few more seconds if anyone else has any. Then we will move into some representations of occultism, especially in the context of SOA, yeah? Here we have some sigils, we have symbols, we have ritual, we have pendulums, we have Ouija boards, we have rituals outside, rituals in solitary space, in many different spaces. And we're pretty much all on the same page here. Hidden knowledge, spiritual enlightened knowledge of reality, of involving or relating to supernatural, mystical, or magical powers or phenomena, right? I love it. So a little brief exploration of historical occultism. And we've talked a lot about these in various different classes, but typically the individuals that were deemed mad or different by ancient societies were the ones that were questioning the norms. They would show up as a select group of individuals that would engage in rituals, rites, discussion, philosophical discussion, practice together to explore these different occult subjects, just like we do at SOA. So are we all mad here? Perhaps. And just a couple examples. And I wish that it was taught more about in my old math class when I was in middle school and high school, right? We get that whole picture of the person, be like, yes, I want to learn the Pythagorean theorem. But the cult of Pythagoras, bringing together the beautiful mirroring of music, of mathematics, of all the patterns in the universe that we talked about. It was like, what? There's a whole poetry to this and you didn't tell us? I feel gypped. We have the cult of Ra, the cult of Sybil, the Freemasons, the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical Society, the Doctrines of the Stoa, all these different philosophical groups exploring the unseen, the unspeakable, the spiritual, the patterns. We talked about patterns right before class. This is where the occult and madness come together, because they're culturally different. They're the ones questioning the reality. Why is it so, right? Is this really how things are? How do we change the reality? And of course, these are the people that have stuck with us for a really, really long time. We all know Pythagoras from our algebra classes. Do we know him from the magical and questioning and philosophical side? Not so much. I wish we did, but this is why we have these discussions, right? To bring that whole picture to the individual. I now want to go into some of the archetypes and states of various occult madness here. And of course, there are many, many more, but these ones feel like they can intersect in many ways with occult practices, spiritual practices, various different cultural practices. And so the ones that we're going to explore this evening are the shaman, the ascetic, the holy fool, the artist, the occultist. And we'll touch just briefly upon theomania, which is really interesting, as we talked about right before class, is this state of being that we are chasing in alignment with divinity, that many of these practitioners, archetypes really are embodying, right? And then of course, substance-induced hypnagogia, which the shaman, of course, many artists, the holy fool, many of these folks work with. And there's also now a revival after there was a shutdown around the 70s and 80s, that it's being revived in psychological clinical practices, which is really interesting right now. And there is a lot of pull and tug between, well, is this part of the ritual, or have we clinicalized it so much that we are taking it apart from its original space, or are we doing it safely, right? So it's bringing up some different questions around that practice too. So the shaman. For those of you very, very curious about patterns, right, and cross-cultural connections, maybe more of a Jungian approach, Phil Borges, who is the photographer that actually, this is one of his photos, he documented various different cultural groups, minority cultures, shamanic-oriented cultures, and he has a fabulous talk that, of course, is on the extra resources for those of you that love your deep dives, and also a film that he's kind of helped produce, develop, called Crazy Wise, that noticed that around the age of 11 to 13, there would be a moment of what maybe in the West would be dubbed as anxiety or depression for particular children in that tribe or that group or that village, that all of a sudden there was a mentor, the shaman of the group, that knew that that was that child's time to learn the occult knowledge, to learn the spiritual practices, to learn the medicine, and that they would take on that lineage, right? And many people speak about shamanic lineages. And for those that have, imagine in the West, if we had mentors for folks, for kids that are going through 10, 11, 12, 13, those moments of being scared, of spiritual awakening, for not knowing that there was a safe person that already knew and they could go there, and that that was a gift versus a curse or something that needed to be medicalized, right? In a way that they could use it in their day-to-day life. Just imagine, right? So the preteen stage was kind of when that anxiety and that mentorship lineage would begin. And he saw this cross-culturally from groups and villages in various different parts of the world. He said, why is no one talking about this? So he began to document their stories, and he has some beautiful photographic works of the shamans of these different cultures. This is where the breaking away from the family would start for that particular child. They'd become kind of the new medicine person within their community. They were also the folks, the shamans, that had a rich inner world and had access to the veil being thin, the liminal space. They were the facilitators, the mentors, the teachers, and the storytellers that would hold the stories of that particular tribe, group, village. They were more, in a way, more sensitive to certain things. For those of you that love more of this cross-cultural anthropology, you would love the work of Mircea Eliade, who documented various different archaic techniques of ecstasy, as he called them, that theia state of being, that manic kind of state of being, as it would be dubbed, to connect with divinity, to connect with whether it is ancestors or a certain type of wisdom, to open themselves up in ways that was safe. And they did this within their own groups. Here I have an example of a Yoruba shaman. You'll see that a lot of mask work in very cross-cultural ways, again, shows up. And when we were talking about the various aspects of self, right, the different parts of self, shamanic work works in that way, which is really interesting. What are the masks? This is where Carl Jung talked about the persona, and anyone without diving into the subconscious, be wary of someone with just the persona versus somebody with just the subconscious and no persona, because then we're not integrated within society and we need both. But from the shamanic perspective, they are kind of holding that for the entire village or for the entire community, but they can go in and out safely to be of service, right? And then I also have here from the Central Alaska, another example of a shaman from the particular tribe there as well. And they work with music, with sound, with medicine, in various different ways to keep the stories of that tribe going. And what's great about the Yupik tribe in particular, they have a whole online library of the medicine music, of the channeled writings, of the stories, of everything that has come through for that particular tribe, which is really amazing when it is documented in that way. And of course, we have some Eastern European representation here and a little bit of a semi-modern representation. of the whispering witches from Poland. And they're these cute little grandmas that I love so much, and they're really quiet, but everyone knows you go to the whispering witch and she'll use different hypnotic kind of states, liminal states, herbs, teas to help with different healing practices. And a lot of it too is the witnessing, is the holding space. It's the allowing the person to be, where in the medical model, when there's only so many doctors and so much administration that needs to get done, there isn't that space for that, right? And this isn't tossing away the medical model, because we still need that, but we do need both. We do need both the witnessing, and this is where the shaman and shamanic work comes in. We also have the work of Edgar Cayce, who's one of the most well-known medium healers in the US that would go under trance. There's a whole library of various different healing modalities and prescriptions or protocols that he would channel and have his wife write down. Did he like going under? No, he resisted it for the longest time because it also had said that it caused him some migraine pains and things like that. And this is again when the West kind of took away some of that ritualistic work, when all of a sudden you have that opportunity or that ability to do that. How do we work with that, right? This is why community is super important in shamanic practices, where otherwise it would be called simply madness and we don't know what to do with it. And then we have the Yupik again here in the corner, and a link, of course, for that library of information for those of you that are curious about that very shamanic practice. We then move into the ascetic. So there is a little bit of kind of an overlap or a shift here, where the shaman takes in the information and goes into that thea moment, the divine moment, gathers the knowledge, the esoteric and occult knowledge, shares it out within the community. The ascetic here is more like the hermit card in tarot. They take in the information, but they want to be removed from society, and they're doing this by choice. And this, if we want to look at it from the madness perspective, we're seeing that the mind kind of overtakes here, where it is kind of self-harming. However, the idea of self-denial is a really big part in a lot of occult practices, whether it is fasting or engaging in certain rituals that help with the self-denial so that you can then move into gratitude, right? We talked about this in our Q&A of, well, I've put this ritual and I've put this practice into place and I'm doing everything right, but we haven't connected yet with the emotion of receiving that or being with that now. And the self-denial is this practice that the ascetic engages in, where they go to the extreme of whether it's not eating or going and living in poverty, taking a vow of poverty, where that when there is something that is received, right, in the material and the physical body world, it creates a spiritual and mind reaction that is much more profound than when we're constantly living in the normal world, right? Like, oh, well, here's a cup. Great, cool, thanks. But when I don't have a cup, I don't have a roof. Oh my God, a cup, right? So this is the ascetics kind of version of this self-denial, to come back into that. And many occultists too have engaged with this to deepen their practice. I always recommend, if you decide to go the ascetic route, to do it in community, to talk to your medical practitioner, let them know what you're up to, because this is a pretty extreme version of, right? Like, we can dub it as madness, we can dub it as spiritual knowing, somewhere in the middle, but it is something that does show up, right? It is also, from when we're disciplining the mind, the ascetic way of doing that as well. And then a reverence for the spiritual being cultivated here. We have, of course, the ascetic Buddha, where after living in the castle, the Buddha decides to leave, and he sees various different parts of life that he was sheltered from. And he wants to find, what is this bigger meaning? And he joins the ascetics. Like, the ascetics are the wise ones. I need to learn from them. So he goes from one extreme with the ascetics to then he goes to another extreme, and he's like, what is this middle path, right? That's that Buddhist way. It's like, oh, I don't need to self-deny, but this is what I learned from it. but I don't need to go into straight riches and abundance all the time. Like, what is this middle? What is this bigger picture? I then have a smaller saint here that isn't as well known, but we're going to go into like the Holy Fool. So she's in between ascetic and Holy Fool. Saint Sophia of Clausura, who worked in the community. Actually, she also kind of fits a little bit of the shaman, but more from an Orthodox kind of Christian mystical occult tradition, where she lived on her own in a smaller remote village, and she would come down and she would do her healings. She would stay alone. She would bring down what she needed to. She would go to the church. She would not eat. She put a vow of poverty on herself. And she said, I am here of service fully, and I am staying here alone to be in divinity in my Thea mind. And that was the life that she lived with, where at this point, right, she's a saint and she was canonized because of this whole vow and staying in integrity with that vow, with that divine promise within herself. Is it for everyone? No. But for those that are called towards that very serious practice, they become canonized. Was that her goal? No, her goal was something very, how do I deepen my relationship with the divinity, with the creation of all, with the reality that is? And her way of doing that was staying solemnly alone, coming down only when called down for, and as a woman of service. And then just another little connection here with the art world. We have another ascetic representation in, again, the blue period of Picasso, noticing that, is this poverty a vow of choice? What am I learning from this experience? Here is somebody that was an ascetic that made this poverty of choice when I am just experiencing poverty, not of my choice. And what is that bringing up for me, right? Within my own occult practice, my own spiritual practice, my own representation of what asceticism does for me or does nothing for me, right? Because the occult can go straight into like manifesting and abundance and all this. But if we don't have, right, as above, so below, left, right, then we won't know. We won't know that, oh, shoot, I am abundant. Well, let me manifest this even more then, because I know what poverty is, right? The ascetic gives the gift, even though it looks mad, it looks very not normal, to appreciate and then grow what already is, if that makes sense, from the ascetic mad perspective. And we see this too in magical fasting on days of the week for keen focus on manifestation from sun up to sunset. We see this in religious practices as well, Ramadan being one main one in Islam. Solitary or contemplative practice for several days or on Sabbats. Many people take their Sabbats really seriously, and that's a solitary witch time. For others, they like to engage with their coven during those times, but that becomes a very deep and contemplative moment to engage with the liminal, to engage with reality, with personal study. And that's really what the gift of the ascetic gives us here. Oh, here we go. It's like, oh no, we skipped a page. We have the Holy Fool, and this is Arsenia Boca. He's actually a Romanian monk that many people know him as kind of a miracle worker, magical kind of mystical monk in that way. And you'll see this very much popularized in Eastern Europe, Russia, Northern Asia, even a little bit in the Middle East. And with the Holy Fool, just like with the Fool card in tarot, and we have some philosopher examples here, we're like, oh my God, what are these people doing? We have the Wise Fool. This is not their first journey. They are already knowing this esoteric wisdom. So I'm just going to have fun with it. I want to cause change. Maybe I don't. I'm living my best life. This is what the Wise Fool is all about. It's also sometimes, based on some of the examples I will share, trolling with a cause. So this is conscious or sane insanity. This is playing the insane, right? being like, I know, but you're all the non-sane ones. I already know this is the game, right? And so this is often challenged or accepted norms to serve a divine or higher purpose. For those of you that are like, ooh, what is this? The Orthodox tradition calls it the Yorodivi, and it's a little bit of the blend of the ascetic of the, and not so much the shaman, because he's doing his own thing. She's doing her own thing. They're doing their own thing. They are, I will share. We have Diogenes. For those of you that want to laugh and be like, oh my gosh, the ancient world was insane. We have Diogenes, who was a wise philosopher of his time. Nobody would know it from how he acted, from like public, like in this painting here, this representation. He's walking with a lantern in like bright sunlight days, and you're like, you're all in the darkness, you don't even know, right? And he's playing the part up. He's playing the fool, doing like crazy things like pooping on the sidewalk and being like, you all don't know what the reality is, you know, and he's playing up this fool. He's completely conscious and aware of this, but what he's doing is his actions are speaking for the questioning, invoking the questioning of reality, of breaking down reality in this way. So this is how madness is represented to a little bit of an extreme with the holy fool archetype within the occult kind of intersections. I had to, of course, include some modern day kind of wise foolery here with Pussy Riot. That was an all-girl punk band that would have these elaborate, we see them here with their masks, avant-garde shows calling out the Russian government for many different problems, especially rights that were non-existent towards women or even hurtful towards women, and using this kind of trolling or misbehavior to enact change. And this can be from a divine space, and it can also be from the higher level space, or the occult knowing that this is the manifestation that I want to have happen. This is coming more from a societal kind of space. And for those of you that haven't watched the documentary Hail Satan, it sounds very opposite, right, of the Holy Fool, but honestly, this documentary does a fabulous job of the tomfoolery of the Holy Fool, knowing like, hey, you're breaking your own rules and you say you want representation for everybody religiously, but you're actually not following the rules. So how are we going to break this down, right? And they use trolling politically to enact these change and these conversations and linguistically change things, have people look at things legally, like our friend Thomas Saz a few slides ago, right? It's bringing in the nuance, it's bringing in the stuff that is the liminal that we talk about in the occult, that isn't given word, or it's not soundbitey enough. So the Holy Fool makes it into a comedic soundbite to enact change in conversation. I love the Holy Fool, if you can't tell, as a Sagittarius. We then have the artist here, and this is Marina Abramovich. Some of you may know her. She became really popular a few years ago in one of her performances called The Artist is Present, because you'll see the art in the art space, but you sometimes can't meet the artist, or the artist is passed. So you would sit across from her, the artist, and you would just witness each other. And she did this for 3 months nonstop. So talk about ascetic, artistic, of occult practices of witnessing and the transformation of witnessing. She brings a lot of that to her work, along with being called a witch and smearing blood on walls and all kinds of things, ritual sacrifice. She has some great work. But of course, we have here some representations of the artist as a cultist, as mad. And of course, I'm going to start with my dear friend Van Gogh. And if you ever have a chance to see any of his pieces in real space, I highly recommend, because each one of his pieces is just so charged with part of, I think we talked about this in a previous class, don't remember which one, about Horcruxes, where each one of his pieces definitely split part of the soul. And you see that in the artwork. And that's the power that Van Gogh brought to the art, and why he still is so present today in pop culture and culture today. But of course, we know that he chopped off his ear. And there were many other theories around why he could have gotten mad around certain plants that were around the field, that they're mixing with certain other plants, and things that were happening in the environment may have caused hallucinations, to he was actually schizophrenic, right? Everyone's going to bring a diagnosis. This is where they're bringing a little bit of that to Van Gogh as well. But if you also look at the film Loving Vincent, another really great one, you'll see that it's actually quite a human story around grief and finding the beauty and connecting with that, again, Thea moment of divinity, of beauty, and trying to capture that. And I think that that's a lot of the work of the artist, and that occultists also would tap into. I think in every class I've brought up Clint, where she had her seance of women that would connect and channel great ancestors, great wise people. And that's where her body of work came through in the Guggenheim. She knew that her work wasn't ready for the world. She knew about divine timing. And she said, after I am gone, it needs to be in a circular temple. Voila, Guggenheim. And that's a big circular museum. So she knew, she's tapped in. When we tap in, we know. We then have Andre Breton here with the glasses, being all Dada and surreal. And what's interesting with him, and I mentioned this in the article that I dropped in the Great Hall, was he was actually inspired by a psychiatrist's work in Heidelberg that collected a bunch of works from an insane asylum. And Andre was inspired by that. And one of the questions that I'll bring at the end of class is, do you think that he maybe really stole these kinds of different works, these styles of works from the MAD, and did not give credit where credit is due, and they were just playing the MAD as maybe a wise fool? I don't know. It's still a little bit of a debate today, and it's slowly coming to the surface that this really inspired the Dadaist and the Surrealist movement. We have the polka dotted, of course, Kusama, who has and is still living in an institution today, and then goes to her studio across the street to engage in her work of personal obliteration, where she hallucinates dots. And that's why you see these dots. She takes what is being internally given to her and puts them on the canvas in the room in the obliteration. There's a fabulous documentary, I think it's on Hulu, about her life and where trauma kind of came from that may have triggered some of these hallucinations, which is really fascinating. But she's made this what seems like a disorder, and can act, it is actually really troublesome for her to deal with on the day-to-day, where she needs extra support to go into the studio. She has made this trouble work for her, serve her purpose. I could not include the Dali. Salvador Dali was also part of the Surrealists, but at the rise of psychoanalysis, he was very interested in the unconscious and the representation of the unconscious here, where he even, a really fun story about Dali was he went to Freud and he said, I had this dream about a giant snail. And then Freud was like, interesting. And then the next day he made a huge sculpture of a snail. I'll see if I can drop it in the Great Hall. And it's like, huh, this is interesting. And if you ever have the chance to go to the Dali Museum, and we talk about personal subconscious symbols and sigils, Dali was very interested in what was my own subconscious symbols. And you'll see he has a whole kind of dictionary around the drawers, around the spindly legged elephants, around the cane, around the snail, that these all have their own particular meanings, that when he dug through enough, he knew what they meant. They were a personal subconscious language, and we all have access to that. So he kind of normalized that as an occult practice as well as creating his own tarot deck and kind of messing about in occult and psychological mad circles. And his story is very interesting, as he had a brother that was born before him that his name was Salvador Dali, and he passed away, and his mom just named him Salvador Dali too. So thinking about what that does to the mind and madness, that would change some things up, right? Talking about literal death and moving into the world as the same brother. Not many people know about that story, and that influences, right, the madness to the practice, to the art that then comes through that person. And then we have kind of going back to the aesthetic of Brancusi, who made very minimalist sculptures. And one of my favorite sculpture of his is the Infinite Tower, where he's reaching up into the divine, and he uses sacred geometry. He uses whatever the form is within to call to him, to open up to that, and to connect with that at a deeper, fully somatic level to reveal itself to him. And he connected with this on a very divine, personally spiritual level. And I'll see if I can drop his work in the Great Hall as well. And that was a quote from somebody of calling him half peasant, half God, because he's this is just what I do. I'm not here to call attention to myself, but the work spoke for itself, bringing in that spark of something occult, something esoteric that was beyond, but very, very simple. So this is where, for those of you that are very interested in some of that more controversial, mad, occult, and art history, Hans Prinzhorn, who was the qualified physician and a doctor of art history, he started collecting the work of mad people in the insane asylum. And he was just doing research at the time. He was trying to find, actually started with good intentions, if some of the art could then help with diagnosis of the patients within the asylum. However, they couldn't really find anything. That the procedures of the time weren't the best for case studies and analysis. So he started collecting this artwork, and then he printed this book right here, collecting over, I think, 300 different artworks that then it got published throughout Europe. So Andre Breton got his hands on it, and it inspired a whole breadth of work as well as a whole artistic movement. And it was heavily illustrated with images from the entire collection. It got a lot of people talking at the time, like, what is art? This is where we get postmodernism to come in as well. But this is slowly, actually even today, starting to be talked about in the current anti-psychiatry, mad activist circles right now of give credit where credit is due. Because we don't know the state of those individuals. They were never given credit. Were they treated as human? At the time in 1922, not so much, don't think so. Of course, we have to go back to the occultist to close up class. And I wanted to bring up just a few people here. Gurdjieff, Jack Parsons, Rosalie Norton, described as mad. One blew themselves up. One was vilified in the Australian news. And actually, Rosalie Norton, there's a recent documentary, for those of you curious, on more female artists, but also called mad because she was a female artist and engaged in witchcraft publicly. She was a non-secretive, very celebrity occultist type of person, and she wore that proudly. And at the time, it just was not celebrated. Jack Parsons, scientist, engineer, worked with explosives, was very well educated and knew what he was doing. There's still a lot of talk about conspiracies right before class. There's a whole thing about conspiracies with Jack Parsons and the US government. And then Gurdjieff, occultist esoteric scholar, one of the creators or kind of popularizers of the Enneagram, which is really popular in kind of Christian circles for Christian occultism. For those of you that are still kind of in the Catholic to Christian to how do I resonate with this? What are the parts that resonate? Enneagram was a really, really great tool that was developed by Goethe from his own internal works, his own occult studies around personality, personal development, manifestation, and making the most of this lifetime here. And he brought that into the West from many kind of more Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian teachers of the time. So kind of some theosophical expansion there as well, but another tool to add to your toolkit for those of you that like to look at not just astrology, tarot, divination, but another one that's pretty well known. And there's some really great resources around Enneagram that tell you about the type that you are, right? Just another tool to add to our toolkit as occultists. So obliteration of the self in occult circles is, we all talk about it, right? We talk about ego death, we talk about persona death, all these kinds of things. Ego death rituals and initiations requiring the psychic death of the adept. Facing the eye of Algol from Michael Ford, who was Luciferian, facing Kronzon while crossing the abyss from Crowley, who was the front of the occult kind of idea or representation. All of these kind of practices very much on the line of madness, right? The self-obliteration, sacrificing yourself to the lake of fire, right? Surrendering to the void. How many times have we heard of these different kind of topics or ways of saying the surrender, right? What does this mean? Is this surrendering to the Theia, the divinity, the beyond? And personally, for me as an occultist, it's always going to be both and. It's the surrendering, and I'm still staying in the earth. I'm still staying in the grounded reality. This is where we are at right now. If there's a different iteration of me in the past or a different iteration of me in the future that is not in an earthly human body, I'm going to use the tools around me. I think there are seasons where there are going to be obliterations, whether we like them or not, or they are of our choosing, right? Like all of these different archetypes that we touched on. There may be seasons of asceticism by choice or not. There may be seasons of artistry, whether we choose it or not, but we're called to that, right? Or it's a need that happens. So there is space for all that. Oh, yeah, trolling with the cause. I just saw that. Yes, yes. So continued readings, because this is brief histories, brief touchings on these various different archetypes of madness, occultism, the cultural definition, how that is so important to defining madness, the openness of biological and psychoanalytic kind of views of psychiatry and how we define madness. I wanted to have just some of these continued readings, films, documentations for you all to come away with your own nuanced kind of vision or solid integration around madness and occult. So the wise fools and orthodoxy, poetry and occultism, the ascetic and art practices, a little bit more on Eldris Sophia, the Yupik people from Central Alaska, how the mad inspired the surrealist, which is that article that I dropped in the school, the Great Hall, the tales of holy fools. So those of you that are more interested in some of that trolling, but some of the orthodoxy and where those kind of origins came from, I believe that's from Yale Press. So it's a bit heavy, but it's a good one. And then of course, Phil Borges' TED Talk and some of his photographic work around the different shamans that he connected with around the world, and these just across the board, very similar experiences from different humans, despite cultural differences. Here we go.